So all I'm trying to do is to get you to realize everything we buy in the store is genetically modified. It wasn't done using a laboratory, but nonetheless the results are extremely dramatic when we look at where they originated. Likewise, even when we look at some of the foods where the genetic modification has been minimal, wild versus cultivated blueberries, wild versus cultivated raspberries, here the genetic modifications are much less slight. And that's why these are the foods that I favor when I go to the store, because they are closer to the wild type. Does that make sense? But just the same, they have still lost, because in the breeding, we've bred for sweetness, for color, for moisture content, for its ability to survive transportation, or to be able to be handled without bruising. And you'll notice nutrition is nowhere in that list of things that we breed things for, generally speaking. So studies that have been done, Europe and North America, have compared the antioxidant values of blueberries, wild versus cultivated. And the wild forms show significantly higher levels of antioxidants. And remember, these antioxidants are really important for you because they protect you from cancer and they promote the functioning of your immune system. Cultivated foods really have had a very profound impact on us. And I'm going to show you slides coming up that really will drive that point home. But some other studies that I want to make you aware of. There was a study done that looked at mothers, and 90% of the mothers took a prenatal vitamin. So these were women who were very interested in their health and the health of their child. And despite the vitamins that they were taking, 50% of the children were vitamin D deficient. Vitamin D deficiency leads to skeletal diseases, diabetes, and schizophrenia. These are some of the things that you are predisposed to without vitamin D. Another study, more pertinent here, looked at college-age women, and 86% of the college-age women were deficient in choline. And choline is a B-complex vitamin, and deficiencies in children lead to lifelong learning disabilities. One of the reasons that you are deficient in choline is because of the foods that are highest, organ meats, butter, and eggs, have been vilified in at least a lot of the United States. That may not be true of the students here, but that is something that we've sort of moved out of our diet. So we tend to completely avoid organ meats from animals. The eggs, right, the cholesterol is too high, and we eat margarine now instead of butter. And all of these things mean that we set our children up for issues like ADHD, etc. You may or may not be aware, 1 in 3 children that are born in the U.S. will develop diabetes. That's a pretty staggering statistic, and diabetes is entirely nutritional, right? That it is something that never has to happen. Diabetes reduces life expectancy by 10 to 20 years. And what's really important, you realize we don't live as long as we used to. More people lived to be 100 years old in 1990 than now. And that's a really compelling point that our health has finally peaked and now it's beginning to decline. Food allergies are up 100% in the last 5 years, and I'll talk about why. And this is what it all comes down to, is really thinking about the next generation and making sure that we have very healthy children that can live up to their full genetic potential. And it's nutrition that allows people to do that. Aboriginal people spent a lot of time in close contact with their landscapes, and really they worked out the kinks in the nutrition. Because the next generation was so important to them, they paid very close attention to the effects of consuming a food on the next generation and made the adjustments necessary so that they had children who were extremely healthy. Our modern day world tends to flood the market. We'll use quantity rather than quality to make sure that we have a next generation, if that makes sense. How many people have heard of Weston Price? A little bit. He was a dentist who toured to most of the continents in the 1930s looking for people who were completely isolated from modern foods. And don't feel bad that you haven't heard of him, despite that he was a dentist. My periodontists and dentists have never heard of him either, which was kind of striking. But this is what he found. when he examined people who still lived on their traditional diets, they had a very distinct suite of features that were missing in their children if they had started consuming white flour, refined sugar, canned foods, cage-reared animals, and the like. And what I want you to notice is the parents of these two individuals here had lived on their diet of wild foods. I want you to notice how broad their faces are and also how wide their noses are. And then look at their children. Look at how narrow her face is and how tiny her nostrils are. What he found happened is that when we didn't get enough fat-soluble vitamins in our diet, one of the easiest ways to observe this was a narrowing of the face. And that narrowing of the face also means that there isn't enough room in our mouth for all of our teeth. How many people here have impacted wisdom teeth? Myself included. You'll notice my hand is raised. Did you ever wonder what the heck primitive people did about impacted wisdom teeth? I did, right? Well, they didn't have impacted wisdom teeth. Their palates were wider and longer, and there was room for all of their teeth. And it only takes one generation of eating modern food for the children to start having crooked and impacted teeth. This is a lady whose parents, these are Australian Aborigines, beautiful teeth, a wide mouth, look at how wide the nostrils are, and the cavities that came when the Aborigine began eating modern and highly processed food. And I'm not going to belabor this point. Everywhere he went, it was the same. Look at these men of the Belgian Congo. These aren't people that I want to mess with. These are robust, healthy, strong, and vital people. Look at these children from the same region. Look at how narrow that face is. That's a poorly developed maxilla, and the middle third of the face is underdeveloped because of a lack of fat-soluble vitamins in their diet. Same thing, the Seminoles. Again, look at the wide jaw compared to how narrow it was after they began to eat the foods that the European cultures brought them. So what I mean by that is it gets worse and worse and worse because we become more nutritionally depleted as time goes on. The agricultural families were larger for the need for laborers, right? It's a hard life. Unfortunately, there are people that are willing to do it for us now, for those people who cannot acquire all of their nutrition on their own. But it is a hard life and it takes a lot of work. And so rather than spacing pregnancies out, moms had big families with lots of children packed close together. That meant that the health of both the mother and each successive child declined because the mother didn't have the ability to replenish stores of vitamins between pregnancies. Does that make sense? Aboriginal groups, on average, waited about 3 years between children. And this was to give the mom a chance to build up particularly fat-soluble vitamins that were really important for the child's health. And they used all kinds of strategies like prolonged breastfeeding, which would prevent pregnancy, abstinence, abortives, natural contraceptives, and even in extreme cases, infanticide, to make sure that children were spaced out so that they could be extremely healthy and be functioning members of the community. What we've all done, or I should say the generations that came before us, is we've traded this traditional feast that you see here for more of the modern Thanksgiving feast, and this entire meal is genetically modified and nutritionally poor. Yes?
I apologize if I sound challenging.
Sorry?
I apologize if I sound
challenging.
No,
you're allowed to hammer me as much as you want.
So I just want to raise the point that, like, we live in a world where there's tons of people.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Let's right now, and that's a good question, and I don't want you to forget it, but that wasn't the case when agriculture got started, right?
Check.
We've kind of let it go far, and now we have to figure out a solution. But what I want to know is there a dispute on the nutritional content of the foods?
No.
Okay, good. Save your question, though, because I do need to answer it.
Okay, thanks.
Don't let me pass it up. In some talks, folks, I give specific examples and I compare wild foods and cultivated foods, kind of similar types. fleshy fruit to fleshy fruit or leafy greens to leafy greens so you can really see some of the comparisons. I don't really have time to do that today, so I'm going to sum it up really quickly. This is the vitamins that we get, the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, in our diet today, and that's what Aboriginal people got. It's 10 times the content. And in terms of water-soluble vitamins, they got 4 times the content that we do now. And when we look at the polyunsaturated fatty acids, these are the fats that are liquid at room temperature. There are a couple of really important essential ones, which you may have heard of, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Their ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 was approximately 2 to 1. In this country, we're approximately 20 to 1. We've altered the type of fats that we eat because we rely very heavily on seed oils, and that's where these are really stacked in. And we get less wild animals, wild fish, and animals raised on pasture. That's where the omega-3 fatty acids come from. The problem is that omega-6 fatty acids are pro-inflammatory, so they create health problems, and they also suppress the functioning of the immune system that predisposes us to a whole suite of chronic disease, including cancer. When we take the cultivated foods to their logical extension, we end up with highly processed foods that a lot of us consume at least to some amount. Any guess what the healthcare costs in this country were in 2008? Throw out a number. I mean, you know it's big, right?
Like 50 or 100% less?
No, the actual figure. What was it?
$1 trillion.
Good guess. Yeah, it's higher than that even. $2.3 trillion. And that's 3 times what it was in 1990. Can you believe it? We spent in this country $2.3 trillion on healthcare. And 75 cents of every dollar was chronic disease. So it wasn't somebody got in an accident and got in a car crash, right? That happens. It was preventable things. Chronic disease is all preventable by diet. And we know this because Aboriginal people did not suffer the high rates of cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. I want you to look at this picture, and I don't want you to feel disgust or anything like that, but I want you to have a really realistic picture of what goes on here, right? In terms of how it affects our health. It's really important that you're aware that, again, when we started consuming cultivated foods, we shrank, our brains got smaller, we started suffering cavities, and a higher rate of infection. Those are all things that we can see by looking at skeletal remains from the archaeological record. And this is perhaps a better analogy to use that will help you to understand what I want you to think of with small-scale family farms. Does a hybrid car pollute? Yes, but it pollutes less, right? But when we see a hybrid car, we all go, good, that's so good. But if it's still polluting, it's not actually good, it's just less bad. Does that make sense? And so organic, small-scale farms are less bad than potentially large chemical agribusiness. Does that make sense? So that's how I want you to think of these farms in the future, if I can. And this is the picture that I want you to think of when it comes to food. That is a stand of wild rice from a flowage that I riced in Wisconsin. And this goes right here. You guys live very, very close to this. And I won't bore you with the details, but its nutrition is significantly higher than the cultivated white rice that we consume, or brown rice for that matter. And these are the types of places that our genes evolved to. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. How many of you have heard of epigenetics? Is it being taught yet? Cool. When I was learning genetics, we believed that the differences between people and between species, etc., was purely or mainly the result of a different gene sequence, the actual base pairs. What we're learning now is that, in fact, our genome is almost identical to that of Homo sapiens that lived 50,000 years ago. We are still wild people genetically. But obviously there's all these changes happening, so what's the deal? The deal is what we expose our body to, food, toxins, pollutants, the works, both good and bad, alter what genes get switched on and switched off for coding of proteins. It doesn't change the base sequences, it simply changes who's being produced and in what amounts. Does that make sense? So these aren't fundamental changes to our genome. It's just we start coding or stop coding for a protein that we need, and we start suffering health effects because of it. That's epigenetics. Not changes to the genome, but changes to what is actively being produced. Okay? That's the difference between us and wild people. Our epigenetic health, to put it frankly, sucks. But epigenetic health is much easier to fix because good food and clean environment, and we can change our own health, and particularly in the generations that go forward. We can start making people, again, that have that robust health of the Aboriginal. A lot of us think about, being a good steward of the land, right? Walking softly on this earth so what we pass to the next generation is as good as it can possibly be. What I'm here to tell you is you have to be a good steward of your genome, because that's what you pass to your child. When you eat poor food, not only does that child have less nutrients to get started, but their epigenetics have been altered, right? The genes that are turned on or turned off have been changed, so that then they start developing food allergies, diabetes, and on from what they get exposed to. So you actually are in possession of a genome that can be provided to someone that will give them the most amazing health you can imagine, but it requires you to eat more wild. If that makes sense? If our culture thought more like the Native Americans, or for that matter other Aboriginal cultures, we'd be in good shape because they think in terms of generations. The Iroquois Confederacy, the impact of each decision must be weighed for the consequences over the next 7 generations. Can you imagine if the shareholders of that factory thought that way? Or if your political representatives thought that way? But unfortunately they can. Our system is built very differently. It's us that vote them into office and keep them into office, not our grandchildren. So the decisions they make are to favor us in the short term, typically, right? It's rare to see long-sighted politicians. And how long do they stay in office? 1 term, right? That's the place that we need to think of when we think of our food coming from, because those are where the wild plants and the wild animals come from. I need us everybody in this room and all of the people that you interact with to stop thinking about reacting and start thinking about proacting.